On a quiet Sunday dinner, my daughter set her fork down, looked past me, and said, "He's not family." The words landed with the weight of a slammed door in a silent house. She wasn't talking about a stranger. She wasn't talking about someone who'd wandered in from the cold. She was talking about the man sitting beside me, my late wife's nephew, the boy I had taken in when he was barely 8, the one whose homework I checked, whose scraped knees I bandaged, whose birthdays I never missed. Her tone was not sharp, but it was final. She didn't even glance my way, as if my opinion on the matter no longer mattered. Instead, her eyes locked on him with a look that said he had crossed some invisible boundary she'd drawn without telling anyone. I saw his smile falter, confusion flashing across his face. His hand, which had been reaching for the mashed potatoes, froze mid-air before slowly retreating to his lap. I tried to fill the silence, to keep the meal moving, but every bite tasted like ash. The clink of cutlery became awkward, the air heavier with each passing second. My mind raced through years of memories. Christmas mornings when she laughed as he tore open gifts, summer barbecues where they chased each other in the yard, the first time she held his hand when he was too shy to meet other kids at school. I thought those moments had built something unshakable between them. I glanced at her, looking for the girl I'd raised to know that family isn't only blood, but all I saw was the woman she'd become, guarded, calculating, already defending a position I hadn't realized she'd taken. Beside me, he kept his head down, chewing in silence, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to make himself smaller. I felt the sting of betrayal, not just for him, but for the promise I'd made long ago to my wife on a hospital bed. I had sworn that no matter what happened, her nephew would have a place in my home, in my heart, in my life. That promise wasn't up for debate. But now, here at this table, with the person I loved most telling me otherwise, I realized that the fight for that promise had just begun. Friends, let me take a short pause. Write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Has something like this ever happened in your life? And if you can, please subscribe and share this video. It truly helps us grow this channel. Now, let's continue. I can still see that night as clearly as if it were pressed between the pages of my memory, a photograph that will never fade. The hospital room was dim, except for the soft, sterile glow from the lamp above her bed. Machines hummed quietly, measuring the moments we had left. Her face was pale but calm, the way someone looks when they've already made peace with the inevitable. She reached for my hand, and I felt how light her touch had become, as though even gravity was letting go of her. Outside the window, snow was falling in slow, deliberate flakes, settling on the glass without melting right away. The world looked hushed, paused, as if it knew not to intrude. She spoke softly, each word taking its time, because time itself was in short supply. She didn't ask about our finances, the house, or even about me. She asked about him, her nephew, the boy she had taken in when tragedy had already stolen too much from his life, the boy who had no one left but us. "Promise me," she said, her voice barely more than breath, "you'll protect him, like he's your own." I didn't hesitate. There was no calculation, no weighing of cost or consequence. In that moment, my heart knew there was only one answer. I nodded, but she held my hand tighter, as if needing more than just a gesture. So I said it aloud, steady, certain, that he would never be alone as long as I was breathing. Her eyes closed slowly, and I remember thinking it wasn't sleep she was slipping into, but a kind of trust, handing me the last thing she couldn't carry with her. That night, I walked out of the hospital into the freezing dark with snow collecting on my shoulders, feeling the weight of that promise heavier than the winter air. It wasn't just a vow to her. It became part of the architecture of who I was. And yet, years later at that dinner table, those few words from my daughter, "He's not family," cut straight through it. They didn't just wound me, they rattled the very foundation of the promise I had built my life around. I realized then that keeping my word to my wife would mean standing against the quiet erosion of loyalty happening within my own blood, and that was a battle I never thought I'd have to fight. That night, when the dishes had been cleared, and the laughter, what little there had been, had long faded from the corners of the house. I stood in the doorway watching him put on his coat. The quiet between us was not the kind you rest in. It was the kind that presses down, heavy and brittle, ready to break under the smallest word. He moved slowly, like someone who was suddenly aware that every gesture might be unwelcome. The boy I had raised into a man now seemed unsure of the ground he stood on in my home. When the front door closed behind my daughter and her family, the stillness that followed was sharp, almost metallic in the air. He stayed, lingering near the hallway, his head slightly bowed as though listening to something only he could hear. Finally, he looked up, and there was no anger in his eyes, only the kind of hurt that doesn't flare or burn, but seeps in quietly until it's everywhere. His voice was small, stripped of the easy confidence he usually carried, and he asked a question that split something in me. I didn't answer, not because I didn't have one, but because every word I could think of felt too fragile, too clumsy to hold the truth without shattering. So instead I stepped toward him and wrapped an arm around his shoulders. He didn't resist, but he didn't lean in either, as if afraid that trusting the gesture might make the loss worse if it was temporary. We stood there for a moment that felt both too long and not long enough, the kind of silence where two hearts speak more than lips ever could. In that quiet, I thought about how family fractures. Not always through arguments or betrayals you can point to. Sometimes it's a single sentence dropped at a dinner table, like a hairline crack in a foundation. You can barely see it at first, but you feel it, and if you ignore it, it grows. That night I realized the crack had already formed, and if I didn't act, if I let it widen, the promise I made in that dim hospital room would one day be nothing more than words I once said to a dying woman. When he finally stepped away, murmuring that he should go, I watched him leave with a heaviness I couldn't shake. The house seemed larger without him, but not in a good way, more like a place with too many empty rooms. And somewhere deep down, I understood that this wasn't the end of the conversation. It was the beginning of a fight I would have to carry on my shoulders alone. It was late, the kind of late when the house has gone still, and the only sounds are the quiet ticks of the old clock in the hallway. I had stepped out onto the back porch for some air, carrying a mug of coffee I didn't really want, just something warm to hold while I tried to steady my thoughts. The kitchen light spilled faintly onto the lawn, and through the half-open window I could hear voices, my daughter's and her husband's. I hadn't meant to listen, but the first sentence froze me where I stood. "He's not blood," she said, her voice low but firm. "He shouldn't get the same as us." The words hung in the air like frost, each one sharp enough to cut. They weren't shouted, they weren't cruel in tone, but that made them worse. It was the calm certainty that stung. She had weighed this thought in her mind before letting it out, and it came out polished, solid, already decided. Her husband murmured something I couldn't catch, but it made her sigh in a way that sounded like agreement. They talked about fairness and what's right for the family, words that, in their mouths, felt stripped of the meaning I had taught her. Fairness to me had always meant protecting the ones who couldn't protect themselves. For her, it seemed to mean protecting only what she believed was hers. I stood there gripping that coffee so tightly I could feel the ceramic edge pressing into my palm. My thoughts went back to the boy, no, the man, inside, who had probably just gone to bed thinking about the look she gave him at the table. He didn't know yet that there were deeper conversations happening behind closed doors. Words about his worth, being quietly measured and weighed and reduced. It struck me that division doesn't always come with a dramatic fight. Sometimes it begins as a whisper behind a wall, a shared glance between two people who think no one is watching. Seeds are planted in those moments, seeds that, if left alone, grow into something with roots too deep to pull out. And here they were, planting them in my own family, in the soil of a house I had worked my whole life to keep whole. I wanted to walk in, to tell her that blood alone doesn't build a family, that love, sacrifice, and shared years do. I wanted to remind her of the nights he stayed up with her when she was sick, the times he stood between her and trouble at school, the laughter they once shared when they thought nothing could change between them. But I didn't move. I stayed outside, feeling the night grow colder, listening as their voices faded into talk of money, houses, futures that didn't include him. When I finally went back inside, the coffee had gone cold in my hand. I set it down untouched. Upstairs, the house was quiet, but I could feel something shifting beneath the floorboards, a subtle, dangerous change that would not stop on its own. And I knew then that the promise I had made all those years ago was going to be tested in ways I never imagined. In my study, the air always felt different. Heavier, still carrying the faint scent of old books and polished wood. It was the one place in the house where my thoughts had the room to stretch out, where I kept the things I didn't want disturbed. Against the far wall sat my desk, and on it, a plain manila folder. To anyone else, it was just paper. To me, it was a lifetime condensed into signatures and clauses. My inheritance plan, written years ago with the steady belief that my family understood what family meant. I sat down and pulled the folder closer. The paper inside was smooth, untouched for months. I knew every line without reading it. My daughter, her brother, and him. Equal shares, no questions, no distinctions. I had written it without hesitation because I saw them all as mine. I thought they saw each other the same way. But now, with the echo of her words still moving through my chest, he's not blood. He shouldn't get the same as us. The plan before me no longer felt like a guarantee of peace. It felt like a fuse, waiting for someone to strike a match. I could picture it, my absence, the reading of the will, and my daughter's face twisting not in grief, but in protest. I could see her looking at him, not with sorrow, but with resentment, as though my final act had been a betrayal to her, instead of the fulfillment of a promise. The thought of it made my hands tighten on the edge of the desk. This was supposed to be my safeguard for the people I loved, but suddenly I could see it becoming the very thing that would tear them apart. I had built a plan on the foundation of unity, and now I could feel the cracks running through it. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking under my weight, and stared at the folder as if it might offer me an answer. I thought about the years he had spent under my roof, his quiet gratitude, the way he had never once asked for more than what was given. And then I thought about her, my own blood, already building walls around what she believed was hers. I realized then that keeping the will as it was would not be enough. Love, as much as I wanted it to, would not outlive me without protection. The promise I made to my wife couldn't rely on good intentions alone. It needed something stronger, something she could not undo with a lawyer's pen or a bitter argument. In that moment, I decided the words inside that folder would change. Not to punish, not to favor, but to protect. To make sure that when I was gone, no one could erase the years, the loyalty, the family we had built together. I closed the folder slowly, the weight of it heavier in my hands than it had ever been before. And as I placed it back on the desk, I knew this was no longer just a will. It was the last line of defense for a promise I intended to keep, no matter the cost. The morning I decided to act was cold, the kind of cold that makes you see your breath even after the sun has risen. I found him in the kitchen, hunched over a cup of coffee, the way people sit when they're trying to start the day but aren't sure what the day will give them. I told him we were going for a drive. He looked at me with a quiet question in his eyes, but he didn't press. That was one of the things about him. He never demanded explanations, just trusted them to come in their own time. We got into the truck, and the hum of the engine filled the silence between us. The roads were mostly empty, lined with bare trees that seemed to bow under the weight of the frost. For a while we didn't speak at all. The world outside passed in shades of gray and white, and I could feel him wondering where we were going, but holding the question back. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my mind fixed on the folder that was no longer sitting on my desk, but in my briefcase behind us. Every mile we drove, I thought about the years we had shared. Not just the birthdays and holidays, but the quiet moments that build the scaffolding of a family. The night he stayed up with me when I got the call about my brother's accident. The summer he mowed every lawn on the street just to help cover a neighbor's hospital bills. The way he had looked at my wife's picture on the mantel every morning as if still speaking to her. These were not the things you could measure in bloodlines, yet they were the very marrow of what family was supposed to be. When the sign for the law office came into view, he glanced at me, his brow furrowing slightly. I pulled into the lot and turned off the engine. For a moment we just sat there, the quiet wrapping around us again. I didn't tell him why we were here, not yet. Some things are better explained after they're done, when there's no space left for self-doubt to sneak in. Inside, the warmth of the building was almost jarring after the cold outside. The receptionist greeted me by name, and I could see him look around, still unsure. We were led into a small, wood-paneled room that smelled faintly of paper and leather. My lawyer came in, smiling politely, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. I slid the folder across the table, opening it to the pages we had marked the night before. As my lawyer began to read, I saw him realize, piece by piece, what this was. His eyes widened slightly, then softened. He didn't say a word, just sat there, shoulders squared, listening as legal language turned my promise into something no one could take from him. By the time we walked back to the truck, the air felt different. Not lighter, the weight was still there, but steadier. He still didn't ask why I had done it, and I didn't tell him. Some promises don't need to be spoken twice. As we drove home, the silence between us wasn't the same as before. It was fuller now, anchored in something unshakable. And though I knew storms would still come, I also knew that, at least in this, he was safe. The pen moved slowly across the page, its tip whispering over the paper like it was etching more than ink. It was carving permanence. I sat there in the law office, the weight of years and promises pressing down on my shoulders, watching each word take shape. My lawyer's hand was steady, the kind of steady that comes from doing this for decades, but I could feel that this was different for me than for him. For him, it was a legal amendment. For me, it was a shield I was building, one I wouldn't be here to hold up when it was needed most. The clause was deliberate, ironclad, not just a line in a will, but a wall. A wall no one could climb over, break through, or dig under. It stated, in language far more formal than my heart could manage, that his share was his by right, tied not to blood, but to my explicit wish. It carried words that made it non-contestable, meaning no courtroom argument, no family feud, no bitter letter from a lawyer could erase it. Even if they tried to twist my intentions after I was gone, this clause would stand like a locked door with no key. I listened to the scratch of the pen and thought of my wife's face that night in the hospital, how her eyes had searched mine not for comfort, but for certainty. I thought of him, the way he had looked at me as a boy, when he didn't understand why the world had taken so much from him, and the way he had looked at me just a week ago, when my daughter's words had cut him down at the dinner table. I realized I wasn't just protecting his inheritance. I was protecting the truth, that he belonged here, that he had been family every single day we'd shared under one roof, that no one's narrow definition of blood could change that. The lawyer slid the document toward me, his finger resting on the space where my signature would go. My hand didn't shake. I signed my name slowly, pressing the pen down hard enough that I could feel the indentation on the next sheet of paper beneath it. When I looked at my signature, I didn't just see ink. I saw a promise fulfilled in the only way that time and absence could not unravel. As I pushed the folder back across the table, I felt something shift in me. Not relief exactly, because the wound my daughter's words had left was still open, but a kind of resolve. The storm was still coming. I could feel it, but I had anchored something in place that the wind couldn't touch. When I stepped outside, the cold air met me like a wall, but it felt cleaner somehow. I walked to the truck knowing that somewhere in that building, in that stack of papers, there was now a line no one in my family could cross. And when my time came, it would speak louder than any argument, any accusation, any rewriting of history. It would stand for him and for me, long after I was gone. Weeks passed before I brought it up. I waited for the right moment, not because I thought it would make the conversation easier, but because I needed to be certain I could keep my voice steady when the time came. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of quiet day where the house smelled faintly of coffee and something baking in the oven. My daughter was standing by the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone, sunlight catching in her hair the way it used to when she was a little girl and I'd catch her laughing in the yard. I told her I'd been going through some old papers, adjusting a few things for the future. I said it casually, like we were talking about repainting the living room or fixing the fence. She didn't look up at first, just hummed in acknowledgement. That was when I let the words slip in. Words I'd been holding in my mouth like a coin I couldn't spend until the right time. Family, I said, slow and deliberate, isn't only blood. It was a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of every choice I'd made in the past month, every pen stroke on that legal page, every promise my wife's last breath had tied to my name. I watched her reaction closely. She froze for just a heartbeat, then her eyes lifted to meet mine. Her smile, the easy, distracted one she'd been wearing a moment earlier, faltered, as though a shadow had passed over it. There was a flicker there, a flash of something she didn't bother to name. Irritation, disbelief, maybe even guilt. But she didn't challenge me. She didn't roll her eyes or cross her arms. She just pressed her lips together and nodded once, sharp and brief, before setting her phone down and walking out of the kitchen. The sound of her footsteps on the hardwood faded down the hall, and with them went the chance for a conversation I had been both dreading and needing. I stood there alone, my hand resting on the counter, feeling the truth settle in my chest. Silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's just a battlefield where no one has spoken the first shot yet. Part of me had hoped, foolishly maybe, that my words would open a door, even a crack, for her to see what I saw. That she might ask me why I'd said it, or let me remind her of the years that had built this family beyond bloodlines. But instead, her quiet departure told me what I needed to know. She wasn't ready to hear it. Maybe she never would be. I stayed in the kitchen a while longer, the sunlight now shifting toward late afternoon, shadows stretching across the floor. I thought about him upstairs, unaware that the distance between him and her had just grown another inch. And I thought about the day when all of this, the will, the clause, the decision, would no longer be a secret. That day would come, and when it did, silence would no longer protect anyone. Christmas that year carried a strange kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't come from peace, but from something everyone is trying too hard not to say. The house was dressed the way it always had been. The tree in the corner glowing with warm lights, the scent of cinnamon and pine drifting through every room. The old ornaments my wife had collected over decades hanging exactly where she used to place them. It should have felt like home. But beneath the soft music and the clinking of glasses, there was a tension that hummed like a wire pulled too tight. When my daughter arrived, her coat still dusted with snow, she went straight to her brother, wrapping her arms around him in a long, warm embrace. They laughed together, and for a moment I let myself believe it was going to be one of those rare days when nothing hurt. But then her eyes flicked toward him, the man I had raised, the one who had been part of our family for most of her life, and her smile shifted into something thinner, quieter, almost absent. She nodded at him, the kind of acknowledgement you'd give a distant neighbor, not someone you'd once shared stockings with by the fire. I saw him straighten his posture, his polite smile holding steady like a shield. He said something kind, something holiday appropriate, and she answered with words that were perfectly civil but hollow, as if she was reading them from a script she didn't believe in. Around them, the rest of the family talked and laughed, but the space between those two felt like a closed door no one dared to knock on. As the day went on, I found myself watching them the way a man watches the horizon when he knows a storm is coming. He would offer her the serving dish, and she would take it without meeting his eyes. She would laugh at something across the table, and he would let the sound pass him by without trying to join in. The distance wasn't loud, but it was constant. A quiet refusal to bridge the gap, the kind of distance that, once it sets in, is harder to cross than miles. I remembered the Christmases when they had been inseparable, chasing each other through the snow until their cheeks burned red, whispering secrets over mugs of cocoa, arguing over who got the last piece of my wife's pie. Those days felt impossibly far away now, like photographs from another lifetime that had faded in the sun. I kept the conversations flowing, tried to make sure the table never went too quiet, but there was no hiding the truth from myself. The room was warm, but the air between them was cold, and everyone could feel it. When it came time to open gifts, she handed him his without looking at him, her voice soft but distant as she said, "Merry Christmas." He thanked her politely, the way strangers thank each other for holding open a door. That night, when the house emptied and I was left with the fading glow of the tree, I stood in the doorway of the living room, looking at the two stockings that still hung side by side. They were just inches apart, but I knew the real space between them had never been wider, and I couldn't shake the thought that next Christmas things might be even colder. The house had gone still after the last door closed behind the guests. Only the faint crackle of the fireplace and the low hum of the refrigerator broke the silence. I stood at the kitchen sink, my sleeves rolled up, hands in warm water, methodically washing the dishes we'd used earlier that day. It was a habit I'd kept for years. My wife used to say the end of a holiday wasn't when the last person left, but when the last plate was put away. I didn't hear her footsteps at first, but I felt her presence before I saw her. My daughter leaned against the doorway, her arms folded loosely, eyes fixed on the floor as if weighing her words. The light from above the sink cast shadows on her face, softening the lines that had begun to show over the years. For a moment, I thought maybe she had come to help, or just to share a quiet moment like we used to after big family gatherings. Instead, her voice came out low, almost casual, but with an edge I couldn't miss. "Are you really leaving him something?" The question hung in the air between us, heavier than steam from the sink. I turned off the tap and set the plate I was holding gently on the counter, water dripping from my fingers. She still wasn't looking directly at me, as though afraid my answer might confirm what she already suspected. When I finally met her gaze, I didn't rush my reply. I wanted her to hear the weight behind my words. "I'm leaving him," I said slowly. "What your mother would have wanted." Her eyes flickered then, a brief flash of emotion I couldn't quite name. Hurt? Anger? Disbelief? It passed quickly, replaced by a tight, unreadable expression. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she pressed her lips together and looked away, her gaze falling on the window above the sink, where the night outside stared back at us. I thought about explaining further, reminding her of how her mother had loved that boy like her own, how she had trusted me with him in her final days, how my promise to her wasn't something I could break for anyone. But something told me this wasn't a moment for persuasion. This was a moment for clarity, for letting her know, without anger but with certainty, that this was not a decision open to debate. She shifted her weight, glanced once toward the living room, and then back at me. The silence stretched on until she finally said, almost under her breath, "It's not fair." And before I could respond, she turned and walked out, her footsteps fading into the darkened hallway. I stood there for a long while, the warm water cooling around my hands, the dishes still unfinished. Through the window, I could see the reflection of the empty kitchen behind me, a room that had always been the heart of our home. But tonight it felt like a border crossing, a place where two people who shared the same blood had stood on opposite sides of something they could not see the same way. I finished the dishes alone, each plate and glass stacked neatly away, knowing that what had been spoken could not be unspoken, and that the next conversation we had on the subject would not be so quiet. It happened 2 nights later, without warning. We were in the living room, the Christmas decorations still up, though the holiday had already passed. The lights on the tree blinked softly, their glow warm against the winter dark outside. I was reading in my chair, trying to let the day settle into quiet, when she came in. Her steps were quick, her movements sharper than usual, as though she'd been holding something in and could no longer keep it contained. She stood in front of me, arms stiff at her sides, eyes locked on mine. "It's not fair," she burst out, the words cutting through the soft hum of the room like a sudden crack in the ice. Her voice was higher now, charged, the kind of tone that comes when someone has been rehearsing their anger long enough for it to boil over. I closed my book slowly, marking the page with my thumb, and looked at her. I didn't match her volume. I didn't need to. Fairness, I said quietly but with weight, isn't about keeping what's yours. It's about giving what's right. For a moment she just stared at me, as if my calmness made her more unsettled. Her breathing quickened. You're giving away what you built. To someone who... She stopped herself, but I knew the rest of the sentence. To someone who isn't blood. The words hovered between us, unsaid but fully present. I didn't break her gaze. My mind was already back in that hospital room years ago, my wife's hand in mine, her voice carrying the only request that mattered. I had made a promise that night. It wasn't written in any contract, but it was stronger than any law. And in this moment, I realized that to keep it, I had to let my daughter see the steel in it, even if it meant she saw me as the one drawing the line. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, then released again. She shook her head, her lips pressing together until the color drained from them. And then, with a sudden turn, she stormed out of the room, her footsteps hard against the floor, echoing through the hallway, before fading into silence. I sat there for a while, listening to the distant sound of a door closing upstairs. The tree lights kept blinking in the corner, oblivious to the fracture that had deepened in the space between us. The book lay unopened in my lap. I wasn't thinking about the story inside it anymore. I was thinking about the one playing out in this house, a story where love and loyalty were being tested in ways I had never wanted to imagine. And though I hated the distance growing between us, I knew one thing with certainty. When it came to that promise, I would not move. Not for her anger, not for her disappointment, not even for her love. Some things you hold on to because they define not just what you do, but who you are. And I could not be the man my wife believed in if I let this one go. The house was quiet the night I began writing them. Outside, snow had started to fall again, thick and slow, muffling the world beyond my windows. I sat at my desk with nothing but a stack of heavy paper, a good pen, and the kind of silence that only comes when you know the words you put down will outlive you. These weren't letters to be read tomorrow or next week. They were for a day I would never see, a day when my voice would be gone, and all that remained of it would be ink pressed into paper. I started with my daughter. The page in front of me felt colder than the winter air, and for a long time I simply stared at it, my pen unmoving. How do you write to someone you love more than your own life, knowing the words will reach them in a moment of loss and perhaps anger? I thought of all the things I wanted to say, the memories of her childhood, the sound of her laughter in the backyard, the way she used to hold my hand crossing the street. But I knew this letter wasn't about nostalgia. It was about truth. I wrote slowly, carefully, telling her that the decisions I had made were not about favoritism or betrayal, but about promises. I told her about her mother's last request in that dim hospital room, how she had placed her trust in me not just as her husband, but as the guardian of what mattered most to her heart. I explained that family, to me, had always been measured in loyalty, in shared burdens and joys, in years spent building a life together, not only in blood. And I told her that while she might not agree now, I hoped that someday she would understand that love can stretch further than a family tree's branches. When her letter was done, I folded it slowly, sealing it with a weight in my chest that felt almost unbearable. Then I turned to her brother's letter, and finally to his, the man who had no idea the strength of the shield I had built for him. Each one was written differently, shaped to the person it was meant for, but all three carried the same truth. My love for them was equal in depth, even if the form it took looked different in their eyes. By the time I finished, the snow outside had piled high on the windowsill, and the clock on the wall ticked past midnight. I placed each sealed envelope in a larger folder, marked for my lawyer, to be opened only when I was gone. My hand lingered on top of it, feeling the weight of what it contained. These letters were more than explanations. They were the final threads I could weave into the fabric of this family, hoping they might hold when I could no longer mend the tears myself. I turned off the desk lamp, leaving the room in darkness, except for the faint silver light of the snow reflecting through the window. As I closed the study door behind me, I knew that what I had written would one day carry my voice into a room I could not enter. And when that day came, it would speak the only truth that mattered. I had kept my word. The room was heavy with the kind of silence that comes when people are together, but not truly with each other. Outside the lawyer's office, the world moved on. Cars passed, footsteps echoed on the sidewalk, but inside, time seemed to hold its breath. The air smelled faintly of leather and old paper, the walls lined with shelves of books whose spines looked like they'd been standing guard for decades. They sat around a polished table, my daughter, her brother, and him. The man I had raised, the one at the center of so much unspoken tension, sat a little back from the table, as if unsure whether he was meant to be here at all. The lawyer's voice was measured, professional, as he read the will. He spoke of properties, accounts, percentages, each word precise, unshaken, even as I imagined the weight of them settling into the room like snow. And then, at the moment I had known would come, he paused, reached into his briefcase, and drew out 3 envelopes. My handwriting was on each one. He passed them out carefully, one to each of them. My daughter held hers in both hands, her fingers trembling almost imperceptibly. She stared at my name on the front, as if it might give her the answers without the pain of opening it. Finally, with a small breath she didn't seem to realize she'd taken, she broke the seal. Her eyes moved quickly at first, scanning the lines the way people read something they think they already understand. But then they slowed. I could almost see the moment her gaze caught on the words that carried the heart of it. My promise to her mother, my definition of family. My choice to protect him, not out of obligation but out of love. Her lips parted slightly, though no sound came. The paper trembled in her hands. She read on, her shoulders stiffening, her eyes darting back to certain sentences as if to test whether they were truly there. I had written them knowing this moment would be difficult for her, maybe even feel like betrayal, but also knowing there was no softer way to tell a truth like this. Across the table, her brother read his own letter in silence, his expression calm, almost reflective. And him, the man who had been at the center of her doubt, unfolded his with a kind of reverence, his eyes moving slowly, carefully, as though each word was something fragile he didn't want to break. No one spoke. The only sounds were the faint rustle of paper and the low ticking of a clock on the wall. My daughter's hand went to her face, brushing at something quickly, almost defensively, before setting the letter down on the table. She didn't look at him, not yet, but her eyes, still wet, stayed fixed on the paper, as if trying to memorize the handwriting, the weight, the undeniable truth of what I had left behind. And in that silence, the battle I had fought while alive shifted into something else entirely. A reckoning she would have to face not with me, but with herself. She sat there for a long moment with her head bowed, her fingertips resting on the letter as if the weight of it alone could anchor her to the chair. When she finally lifted her eyes, they were rimmed with red, glistening in a way that told me the tears had come quietly, without the sobs that shake the body. These weren't tears of grief. She had already begun mourning me days ago. No, these were the heavier kind, the kind that come when a truth you've resisted for years finally slips past every wall you've built to keep it out. She looked at him then, not for long, but long enough for something to shift in the air between them. There was no apology in her face, not yet, but there was a crack in the armor, a small fracture where the light of understanding could begin to slip through. Her gaze softened just enough to show that she had seen what I needed her to see. That love is not bound by the veins it runs through, but by the hands that hold you when you're falling, the shoulders that carry you when you can't stand. No one spoke, not her brother, not even the lawyer who sat waiting for questions that never came. The silence that filled the room wasn't tense anymore. It was steady, calm, like water that has found its level after a storm. There was no need for raised voices, no fight to break out, no cold dismissal of my words. The will stood exactly as it was written. Every clause, every share, every decision remained untouched. The silence was the verdict. He folded his letter carefully, the way one might fold a fragile keepsake, and slipped it back into the envelope. He didn't look triumphant. There was no victory to claim because this had never been a battle for him to win. It was a promise for me to keep. Her brother sat back in his chair, glancing between them with a faint nod, as if silently acknowledging that something long overdue had just been settled. I imagined my wife in that moment, her hand in mine again, her eyes watching from somewhere I could not see. I imagined her smile, not the radiant kind she showed the world, but the quiet one she reserved for moments when she knew something was safe. This was that moment. The promise I had made to her, sealed in the dim light of a hospital room, had survived every attempt to chip away at it. When they left the office, they did so without slamming doors or turning away from each other. They walked out into the winter air together, each carrying an envelope that would remind them, in their own way, of what had been decided. And though the space between them would still need time to heal, there was now a foundation under their feet that could hold their weight. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it lives in the quiet that follows the last word, in the stillness where no one feels the need to argue because the truth has already settled in their bones. And in that silence my promise stood, unbroken, immovable, and exactly as I had meant it to be from the very beginning.